number 2 is on. So I'm covered. I don't know if you're any setup on your side.
Nope, I'm ready to go.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, thanks. I appreciate you coming to talk to me today to tell me these three stories.
Hmm.
Um, what's your name?
So I'm Robert Sabourin.
And what is the name of the first story you're going to tell?
Well, I call it the Mutual Fund Transaction Clearinghouse story. It's a pretty boring name for a pretty boring story.
Okay. Is it a negative, positive, or typical experience, would you say?
I wanted to start with a typical one. It's a typical one.
Okay. So, what was your role at the time of this story?
I was hired as an external consultant. So there was a company was interested in learning how to improve their software development practices from the point of view of testing, and I was one of 2 consultants brought in to do a analysis of their whole testing and software engineering deployment workflow. And so my role was an external consultant expert in software testing process.
Okay. How much experience or, time in this role would you say you had at this point?
So, as an independent consultant at that point, I probably had about 10 years of experience as an independent consultant. But in the domain, I had been working in the domain for probably closer to 25 years.
Okay. Well, so what was the lead up to the story?
So the
How did
lead
you
up
do
to
it?
the story, yeah. This I have some my own notes here because when I prepared for this, I made some notes just to
Okay.
help guide me because I didn't want to miss something
Okay.
important. So first of all, lead up. So I was contacted to review and audit the testing process by one of my major customers. And I was asked to identify weakness, identify specific areas of process improvement, identify areas in which automation might be helpful, identified ways to streamline the process, and I was given a fully documented process which they said they believed they practiced. Huge monster brick, about like 2 inches thick. So I was given all this up in front. We had basically selected about 40 people to interview over 2 weeks, and this was basically people that were selected by my customer, but from different teams in different roles and different responsibilities.
Okay. When did the story take place?
The story took place in somewhere in 2009 ish.
Okay. Okay. So go ahead and please tell the story.
Okay, so this is a story that there's I think a teeny bit of humor. The person I was working with had actually more experience than I did in this type of gig, about the same amount of experience as I have overall, but much more experienced in this type of contract. I was with this person every day, and after 2 days, he started calling it Groundhog Day after the movie Groundhog Day because every day we woke up and we did the same thing and we did the same interviews and we were meeting different, and it sort of like was repetitive over and over again. So it was reminiscent of Groundhog Day, and we followed a similar pattern every day for 2 weeks when we interviewed these 40 professionals, these 40 software engineering professionals. And I have to say that it's 40 of a team of hundreds and hundreds. We didn't meet everybody. We met a sample of the people. When we met the people, we had asked them to share stories with us. And the type of stories we asked them to share with us were stories about bug escapes to production. Particularly, we were interested in bugs that they felt, their personal opinion was, that these bugs should have been caught somehow as part of the deployment process or part of the development process or part of the testing process, but that they weren't caught. So we asked people to share stories about bug escapes. The interviews, I tell you, we did a lot of task analysis interviews, and we broke, I think, some of the principles that I like to follow in these. For example, several of the interviews had 2 interviewees and 2 interviewers. So several had that. But for the most part, we were basically 2 interviewers and 1 interviewee. So the case I'll tell you here is the case of 1 interviewee. But we did, there was all sorts of variations of it, and it was actually out of our control. The customer really dictated who we were going to meet when. And if they said you had to talk to these 2 guys at the same time, No matter what we did, we had to talk to those two guys at the same time. So during an interview, we would meet with, let's call him Fred. We'd meet with Fred. We'd make Fred feel welcome. We'd talk to Fred about things that we had common interests in outside of the topic of the interview. One of the things that was a favorite question of ours was to ask if there was any local food that was available in their region that was special for their region, and for them to suggest to us restaurants to go and eat that sort of special food. A lot of this took place in Kansas City, so there was a lot of discussion about barbecue and catfish and stuff like that. So we started by trying to make Fred feel comfortable talking about local restaurants and such. This basically breaks the ice, if you will, a little bit. We told Fred that we were going to make audio recordings of the interviews. We showed him the devices we were using for audio recordings. We also told him that we were only using the recordings for ourselves and that no one except for the interviewers were going to have access to them. And we kept that commitment, of course. We basically also said to Fred that we would be creating mind maps of the interviews, and Fred was welcome to look at the maps as we went if Fred wanted to. It turned out that Fred didn't want to, actually. I don't think many people want to, but I want to make sure people feel aware of what's going on. Like, I'm not making a transcript of what you're saying, so I was making a map of the concepts that Fred was talking about. We also took handwritten notes of the interviews. So we had, while the interviews were going on, we had handwritten notes, we had mind maps, and we had audio recordings, and lots of evidence about it. So we start by asking Fred about their job, the questions that you were asking me about the experience in the job, about the experience in the domain, about what they did before. What was their previous job in this company? What department were they in? What was their job before? And then where do they fit in the org? And very often we asked them if they could draw a picture for us of the org chart and where they fit into it. And surprisingly, most people had very different views of what the organization looked like. But you see it from their perspective. We asked which team they were in, what technologies they used, and then we asked them to share 3 stories about bug escapes. So one story would be a success, failure, and typical. And during the stories, invariably, so when Fred started, Fred obviously was talking about a success. So there's some sort of bug escape that they were able to fix quickly, and it was a heroic effort, and he had all sorts of things to say about that. But Fred kept talking about stuff that had very little to do with what he did. He talked about what other people did, what the customer was doing, what the end user was doing, what the DBA was doing. All these people, and of course, we didn't want that. We wanted the story from his perspective and the first person things that he did. And so we did end up having to refocus Fred a lot. But that, I think, is something that comes out of the first story. By the time you get to the second and third story, that refocusing isn't needed anymore. People catch on pretty quick. Fred would catch on really quick to that. And so we wanted to hear what Fred did, not what someone else did. So we got him to that tempo, that mood. Then we collected the story. Once we had the story, and of course the story I expected only take about 15 minutes to tell, but sometimes people get carried away, so you got to manage things a bit. But Fred told the story. I told it back to Fred. Here's the story you just told us, Fred. And I gave him a real, summary of it, bullet form, looking at my mind map. And Fred then immediately corrected me because I had screwed up all sorts of things. I had the steps in the wrong order. I was missing stuff. I had the wrong names. And by reading it back to him, telling it to him, he corrected me. I fixed it. And then I asked for exemplars of some of the objects that Fred had mentioned. Now, I can't remember right now which ones I asked for. Usually there were statements of the requirement, maybe the bug report that was filed, maybe the code changes that were made, maybe the test case that was run. I asked for exemplars of things that Fred mentioned, not things that he didn't mention, things that he did mention. So Fred didn't say test plan. I didn't ask for a test plan. Then I asked why it was considered a success, fail, or typical story. I asked what Fred should do different next time. I asked the famous magic wand question. What would change? What would you change if you had a magic wand? Thanked Fred profusely Then, so Fred leaves immediately before anything. Fred leaves immediately. I do a quick review of the notes. A quick review of the notes. I immediately try to capture quotable statements. Because I was obliged to do an analysis, I was obliged to make a report. I wanted to see, did anything Fred just say catch me as something that I want to quote or I may want to quote? So I wanted to highlight those right away while it was fresh. Then I replayed the whole story to me at twice the speed, reviewed and adapted mind maps while listening to the story, and reviewed, of course, when I received them, the exemplars, compared this to what other teams did, and every single time I got a new story, I would construct a bit more of my report. And I think that's the end of my typical story.
Okay. Why did you consider this story a typical story?
Just because of actual basic math. There was like hundreds of these I did.
Okay.
So this is quite common. The topic is different. It's not always requirements. It's not always bugs, but it's almost always the same type of setup as this. So I think this is just very common for me.
Okay. So you said this happened in 2009.
Ish, yeah. I don't remember the exact date. Yeah.
Ish. Okay. And it was roughly over 2 weeks that you were doing these task analysis interviews.
That's right.
And you said you had roughly 40 people.
Yep, 40 people.
That were chosen by the sponsor.
The customer, yep.
Yeah, the customer, yeah. Is that typical? Do they usually do that, or do you usually get to pick more yourself?
I am, if I'm given the chance, I will first meet with a few people, and then I will decide who I want to meet next based on what I've met from a few people. So I'll actually work around stories instead of work around people. But the customer here had an old process which was role-centric. So because the process was role-centric, they felt they wanted us to talk to all the different roles. So we started based on their model of their old process. It's certainly I would do differently in another organization. I would go in and I would look for a good story. I wouldn't even talk about who are the people. I would talk to the organization and some stakeholder and say, when was the last time you had a major recall because of a bug escape? And they would tell me this from their point of view, an example. And then from that, I would find out who I should interview.
Okay.
To learn about the story. So in this case, we were really prescribed who to interview. And I like to have a choice in it.
Okay. Yeah, so you mentioned that you were focusing the stories on bug escapes to productions and bugs that people felt should have been caught.
Yep.
Why did you decide to use that as your motivating area?
Well, I don't really remember all of the alternatives. The two other alternatives we looked at was test cases and requirements. And we felt that requirements would probably tell us more about the software engineering process, but it wouldn't help us to identify some of the elements in our goals. Like, for example, test automation issues wouldn't have come out of a review of requirements, I don't think, as well. Or streamlining issues might not have come out of the requirements. The other thing we thought might be fun was test cases, but both of us had experience in this, and we knew that there's so much variability in what is a test case and what people call test cases that we would spend so much energy trying to harmonize the information that it would be harder to extract useful recommendations from it. So I think this is those are two big ones we considered. I don't remember the other ones we considered, but we sort of went through that rationalization that we could have looked at test cases, we could have looked at requirements, we could have looked at bugs. Let's look at bugs. That's what we came up with.
Yeah. And so then out of this interview, it sounds like you had the recordings of the interview itself.
Yeah.
You had some written notes.
Yep, and mind maps.
And mind maps that you would make. And then you also collected, you said, about the exemplars. You asked for exemplars.
Right.
Why is that something that you asked for?
Well, it's if it was part of the story, or if I suspected it might tell me something about the story, I asked if we would be allowed to see it. I wasn't challenging the person. If the person sounded at all hesitant, we'd say, well, then don't bother. But we certainly wanted to see the physical evidence of it. We wanted to see the actual stuff like here's the code we changed, here's the bug report we filed. We wanted to see them so that we can dive into making specific recommendations as to how to improve them, or even eliminate them or replace them with something different.
Okay.
This is as opposed to looking at every possible object. We're only looking at objects that were mentioned as part of the incident we're hearing that we think are interesting. So we're narrowing it down to a small subset of all of the documentation available.
Okay.
This was also, keep in mind, a financial company. So they had a lot of audit trails. They did have a lot of documentation.
Okay, interesting.
Yep.
Is there anything that I missed or anything you'd like to add?
To that one, no, not particularly. If I think of it, I'll let you know offline. But I think that's about all I had to say about that for now.
Okay, great. Thank you.
That's okay. Do you like another story?
Yes.
I got a good one. A really good one.
Okay. What's the name of this story?
I call it Jason Bug Isolation Story.
Okay. Is this a negative, positive, or typical?
This is as negative as it gets.
Interesting. Okay.
No, this is a failed task analysis interview. I don't want to say that's bad. I learned a lot from this interview, but it's really been screwed up.
What was your role at the time of the story?
Okay, so I was an independent consultant being asked to participate in a community peer conferences to help improve the practice of exploratory testing. And a group of about 20 professionals who practice the craft and teach it and consult in it were asked to get together in 2006 in Melbourne, Florida, for what's called the Workshop on Heuristic and Exploratory Techniques.
Okay. What was your experience in the role at the time?
Well, to be an independent consultant at the time, so I was an independent consultant for about 6 years at the time, practicing the specific domain of testing. I was one of the pioneers in that in the mid-1990s. So I would say about 11 years, and I would say it's very hard to find someone with more experience in that at the time.
Okay. So what led up to this?
What led up to this? Dr. Kem Kainer hosted this conference, and he sent invitations out to people. And so I did get the invitation, and I was excited to participate. But this was an invitation that included preparatory work. He actually gave us some books to read, and what he wanted to do during the workshop was task analysis of exploratory testing to help identify what do skilled exploratory testers do and how regular testers can develop the skills needed to become skilled exploratory testers. So that was the mission, and we had homework to do before it. So this story is part of the homework and part of the conference.
Okay, great. Please go ahead and tell the story.
All right. So this was prepared in Montreal. So I'm in Montreal. The conference was going to be in Florida. And we're talking about like 6 weeks out, 6 weeks in advance of it. So I get the invitation to go to WHET. And WHET is an acronym, right? WHET, Workshop on Heuristic and Exploratory Testing. And the theme is task analysis. I'm given some preparatory reading to do, which I read, and I didn't just read it. I read it thoroughly, and then I mind mapped it and read it again. It was phenomenal. A really amazing exposition to the field of task analysis for me at that time. Then what we tried to do, and we were all encouraged to do some preparatory example collection. So basically do a task analysis interview of someone who does good exploratory testing. So I basically thought, what is good exploratory testing? And I thought, well, even if people don't call it exploratory testing, people who practice testing very often have to do bug confirmation testing. And that, the appropriate clarifying question is, what is that? That is the type of testing where someone says they fixed a bug, and you want to make sure it was really fixed. So it is actually inherently exploratory. And there is a kid at the time who I had been working with since he was 15 years old, and at the time of the story, he was probably in his early 20s, and his name is Jason. And he worked part-time as a student in software testing literally since he was 15 and had summer jobs all the time in testing. And this guy was loved by the programmers. The programmers just loved working with this kid. He's an amazing guy. They love working with him. And I knew that the programmers used to want him to actually do the bug confirmation testing for their bugs. And he was very good at it. He was gifted at bug confirmation testing. So I decided, let's interview Jason. So I basically met with Jason, explained to him that I'd love to hear him tell a story of an example of a bug that he confirmed for one of these projects I'd worked on with him over the years. And he basically told a story, and it was an interesting story, and I thought it was really cool. And he told his story, and I was listening and taking notes, mind mapping. The whole thing lasted about 30 minutes, and I thought, fantastic. I took this and I looked at my notes afterwards. I said, this is wonderful. And in fact, since that day, I have been using the example of Jason's bug confirmation testing in my exploratory testing and practice classes. Always I start off with that as an example. It's a beautiful example, and his approach was just, for me, so fantastic. And that's why the developers liked to work with him. It wasn't because he was a particularly technical guy or a programmer. It was, I think, because of his strategies. They just loved it. Anyhow, so I went to the conference, and what I wanted to do at the conference was to basically have a breakout session. And in the breakout session, what I wanted to do was go through the audio of my interview with him and identify objects, actions, and get hints about the key skills involved. And I knew, because I'd been studying my mind map, I knew this was going to be a really fantastic thing. And just I thought, we'll get some people there. And in the room, there was myself and two other members of the peer conference. Now, in parallel to my breakout session, there were a whole bunch of other breakout sessions, and frankly, most of the guys were at the other breakout section, so mine was just a teeny weeny one. But I thought it would be a good example of, let's look at an interview and let's draw some lessons from the interview. But when I listened to the recording, it became obvious that I had made a fundamental error in the interview, and I was actually asking leading questions, introducing vocabulary, introducing concepts, and getting Jason to talk about them, but obviously following my lead. Now, I was never telling him what he did, but I was giving him the vocabulary to describe what he did. I was giving him so much information that it was taken away from, are you hearing Rob's model or are you hearing Jason's story? And after about 5 minutes of this, they asked me if I could advance the recording to the point where I let Jason actually tell a story. And I had thought that I had let Jason tell a story for the whole half hour. Well, it worked out that Jason hardly had 10 minutes of talking, and it was almost all framed by stuff that I said. In the end, it looked like a sports interview where people are sort of talking to football players after the football player's been knocked out, and what you're trying to do is get the guy to say yes or no and give him all sorts of context. So I was not able to do task analysis from that interview, and I basically, I was guilty of introducing terms, concepts, and models which biased the story. And it didn't make it a useful story for task analysis purpose. It did make it a useful story for me to teach exploratory testing. But from task analysis, I had basically biased the whole thing. So even though I did get a nice example of bug isolation, it was not useful for task analysis. Now, just for continuity, I want to share with you the approach that Jason took, because this is what he did. So the developer would bring a bug to Jason to confirm. Jason would demonstrate that bug really happened in the original build. Then Jason would demonstrate that the bug does not happen as reported in the new build. Then what Jason would do, and this is the brilliant step, he would identify a usage scenario which would have exposed the bug in the original build. Then he would run the scenario on the original build to show the bug would be exposed. Then he'd run the scenario on the new build to show the bug is not there. And then what he would do is repeatedly vary the scenario on the new build with different perturbations of data or of order of operations every step to see if the variations exposed the bug or caused the bug, or the bug moved, or the bug was introduced somewhere else. And he would continue until the perturbations were absurd. And when challenged, what is an absurd perturbation, he said, it's a perturbation when a developer would tell him that a customer would absolutely never do that. In fact, he said customer would have to be brain damaged to do that. So that's when he knew he had enough perturbations. Anyhow, so that's the end of my my story with failed task analysis interview. There is a happy ending. I learned a lot, but it was a lousy task analysis.
Okay. That was so out of that though, it sounded like you got future exercises and ideas that you could use. You didn't get a task interview though.
You know, that's what I like to do. I like to learn from things, and when you sort of hit your head against the wall running, you make a mistake like this, you got to leverage it. I learned a lot, and I wasn't embarrassed. I wasn't shamed. I really learned why it's critical to get the person to talk, to get the person you're interviewing to tell a story. Don't frame it. Don't write a bunch of questions in advance. Don't give them leading stuff. Don't introduce vocabulary. Don't let them tell the story, and they'll talk about what's important to them from their perspective, and you work the vocabulary out. But this is one of the key points where I learned that. So I have to say that failed task analysis taught me a lot.
Oh, okay. Well, great story then. A good experience.
Yeah.
Long term.
Yeah, long term, exactly.
Cool. So, do you have another story for me?
So that's that story. Yeah. Let's see here. Let me see. I have one more.
Yeah, maybe one that's a success.
Yeah, I have a successful task analysis interview story.
Okay. What's the name of this one?
I call this one Bell Canada Software User.
Bell Canada. Okay. When did this happen?
I'm trying to position it. It's about the same time as the wet one, maybe 2007-ish, 2008. It's a teeny bit old, but it's a very, very happy ending. But it's a teeny bit old, but I think it's quite relevant still. I prefer newer ones usually, but I'm gonna pick this one because it's happy ending.
Okay. What was your role at the time of the story?
So I was a trainer, a professional trainer, and I was teaching test design. I was brought into a company to teach test design, so I was, in this story, a trainer.
Okay. How long had you been doing that role for?
That role at the time for professionally earning bread and butter, let's say about 8 years at that time. Yep.
Okay. And
my domain experience, of course, is much longer than that. So 20-something years, yeah.
Gotcha. That's what I was going to ask. Okay. So what led up to this story?
All right. So I was brought into a big Toronto-based network management company to help to teach members of their testing and business analysis team and programmers actually test design. So they wanted to learn some test design skills. They were weak in test design, and I knew many of the stakeholders in the company. They deliberately asked me to come and develop an adapted version of some sort of course material I had to teach them test design. So they brought me in, and the story took place during that training period. It's a 3-day on-site course in Toronto.
Okay, and just briefly, can you describe what you consider test design to be, or give an example of what test design is?
Test design, well, let's say you're given a testing objective, something you want to learn about, and you've got to figure out specific data, specific operations, specific decisions. Test design would be the activity to figure out specifically what you're going to try.
Okay.
So
great.
There's a lot of different ones, but the one that comes up in this thing is called user scenario test design, where you try to create a step-by-step description of what the user does and then walk through it from beginning to end with different variables every time.
Okay. Okay.
That's what I sort of mean by test design.
Okay. Please go ahead and tell the story.
All right. So Toronto, it's not my favorite city to visit, but I'm a Montrealer, so Toronto, it's hard to tell Toronto stories. But I was at the on-site course teaching these concepts. So the background was most of the people had a lot of testing experience or development experience, but not a lot of test design knowledge. So they needed to hear it. So I was teaching various concepts, starting with the philosophy and the purpose of testing. Then I dove into the SDLC, which is the software development lifecycle. I taught them stuff about variable identification, and then I taught single variable test design approaches. So if you have one variable, what value should you choose? And then I dove into multiple variable test design. And you think now it's about a day and a half into a 3-day course. I'm teaching multiple variable test design. And one of the first ones I teach is called usage scenario based test design. And in this, I'm teaching them how to create storyboards. And so I have exercises I do in class where I ask them to sort of storyboard some sort of user experience so that we can design some tests around that. And they got the storyboard concept very, very well. They got the storyboard concept. And when I gave them the generic exercises, they did it brilliantly. It was fantastic. They got the generic stuff like first shot. Send an email with an image attachment, walk through the story, make a storyboard, all this stuff. They got it all figured out. Identified the variables, identified the decision points, everything, knew how to walk through it. It was grand. But when I asked them for the second exercise, which is to work in small groups and identify usage scenarios for their own software, frankly, everyone failed. They couldn't do it. They couldn't grok it. They couldn't figure it out. And they were basically at a loss for describing, from the usage scenario perspective, what customers did with their system. And some testers even confided in me that they said that they felt this approach could not possibly work for their systems. And I thought, that's interesting. I've never heard of a system where this approach wouldn't work. I mean, this approach has saved my skin in deep crises over the years. So this is an important approach for me. How could it not have any value at all? So for me, this could have been a great learning experience. What is the case that doesn't work, right? But instead, I sort of asked them, well, wait a sec. Do you have access to a customer? Do you have a customer somewhere around here? Can you get me in front of a customer? And I was told that Bell Canada's office was next door. This was by the test lead. And I was told that Bell Canada was their largest customer. Again, this was by the test lead. So I basically said, can I see them? So the test lead immediately fetched the account manager. Now, the account manager came over. The account manager is a business side sales guy. And he sort of listened to me and heard my story of task analysis and all this type of stuff. And I wanted to do a task analysis with the customer to identify usage scenarios. So the account manager got all excited and thought this was the greatest thing. And so he called Bell and he made the arrangements. And literally within an hour, I and all my students were at the offices of Bell Canada, and I was interviewing their main user of the software. This is an awesome experience, a chance to do this. I had instructed all of the delegates and students who were with me, I instructed them to be very, very quiet. Do not say anything. Do not bias this, because I'm so lucky. I was so ignorant of this system that I could really do a beautiful job of an interview without introducing concepts, right? Because I was naive. I didn't know how it worked at all. So I'm learning everything. They risked biasing things by the way they asked questions. So I at first, the user wanted to tell me about the product. I use this button, I use this menu, I use this file structure, I use this interface. And I said, no, I don't want to hear that. Don't tell me that. I want to hear how you work. So eventually they finally described their job, not how they used the product or not what part of the product they used, but what was their job. And once they got to talking about the job, they basically shared with me several examples of what they do. And from the examples, I, using flip chart sheets of paper, created a storyboard. So each frame is a point where someone is entering data or making a decision. I made this big storyboard, like I had a wall all full of these sheets. Then with the customer, I reviewed the steps. I identified and reviewed the decision points. I made lots of mistakes. I corrected the errors based on input from the customer. I added things to correct omissions. I removed things to correct redundancies. Furthermore, I collected several relevant exemplars after walking through the storyboard, thanked the user profusely, and returned to my customer next door, right, There wasn't even a Starbucks between them. I was hoping to get a coffee. I just walked right in next door. And I found out, so I walk in there and I found out these guys are like pale. They're pale. They're pale. And I find out, what happened? What's wrong? They had no idea. The way the customer was using the system was dramatically different from anything that they understood or imagined. Any of them. None of them. None of the testers, none of the programmers, none of the support staff, none of the product managers. Nobody had a clue what customers really did with the software that they were buying. And of course, for me, this was a beautiful example of the power of task analysis with this method, because I really learned without knowing anything in like about an hour knowledge that would dramatically help them. And they had problems in test design a little bit because they didn't really know what to focus on. And so if they start understanding what do people really do with the software, well, at least that gives you an axis to sort of figure out what to focus on. So that's my super duper successful task analysis story.
And so why did you consider it specifically a positive story?
Well, I felt that I was able to positively influence a change in the whole business with one task analysis. I really, really changed things. I influenced change big time because of this. It was very influential. That's why I consider it successful. Also, it helped them learn the testing concepts, which was my I was there to teach this type of test design. So doing it in person really, really helped.
Mm-hmm. How often do you think that the usage of this software is so dramatically different from what the people testing the software think it is?
Right now, at this particular company, at the time I did this story, there was probably 100% disconnect. Like everybody was disconnected. So the only people I think that really understood it were the highest level executive stakeholders and shareholders, believe it or not. Everybody else in the chain were like, they're building the technology and not realizing how the technology is useful. So I can't think of an analogy in any other business except I'd never seen this before, that people were developing something that was so complex and they were so clued out as to how people were using it.
Mm-hmm. Was there a point in the class where...
Maybe Marin Software in San Francisco is something similar.
We'll have to save that story for another time. So was there a point in the class when you made that decision to go talk to the customer? What made you take that leap? That just because of the adjacency, or
frankly, I would have been happy for a half-hour Skype with a customer. So okay. I was fishing, just get me a customer somewhere. If I couldn't find a customer, I would have said, get me someone in the training department, or someone who can proxy a customer. But I wanted to show them this interview, an example of this sort of way to learn what scenarios are and storyboards are, and the interviewing approach. I wanted to show it to them. I felt that lecture material just wasn't working, and the exercise, like for the stuff that they understood, Gmail, it was great, but for their own product, they didn't understand it. I couldn't believe that. It was so far off of my experience. So I just felt I had to show people. Mm-hmm. But I didn't expect their Bell to be right next door. That was the cool icing on the cake here. I thought I'd have to Skype someone in another country for a half an hour to do a task analysis interview, like someone from Portland or something.
So did you have anything that came out of this that I assume you had notes from this, or how did you analyze this at the time, and what did you take away from it?
Well, I basically I focused on the teaching of the course. I finished the course,
okay.
And I did make a lot of mind maps because I had a debrief with the testing manager, and I wanted to see if I could get further work with them in sort of their software engineering process, but I wasn't able to do that. So my work there didn't continue in the process management area. I believe I did come in and do other training at different times for the company, but I was never brought in to consult on process improvement, which I think I could have helped them a lot with. And so I tried to turn this into an opportunity for me to do that type of work with them. That didn't succeed, but that's serendipity. I didn't expect this to happen in the first place.
Gotcha. Okay. Anything we missed or anything that you came to mind as we were talking here?
No, except that when I tell the story, and I remember what happened very vividly. Uh, I got the storyboard wrong when I put up the flip chart sheets.
Hmm.
And some people think that I did it on purpose, that I deliberately got it wrong. And I did not deliberately ever get it wrong. I really sincerely try to get it as right as I can when I put the thing down because I don't want to waste anybody's time. I'm not just trying, not playing games by making it wrong on purpose. But you
Hmm.
do get it wrong because the person skips a step when they tell the story, or the person does it in a backwards order, or you record it wrong. So I just want to say I never deliberately do it storyboard it incorrectly, but almost always you're missing a step or you have a redundant step. There's something that's missing. And when you have these storyboards, also you can ask other types of questions. Like, for example, if you have a decision point, you can say, all right, you just told a story where the decision went this way. Can you think of another story where a decision went another way? And learn from that. So it
Hmm.
helps you find new stories that might be interested in hearing about.
Do you feel like storyboarding is a common technique that you use when doing task analysis, or is it kind of a special purpose thing that you bring out when you feel it's appropriate?
Well, I see it in task analysis and user experience testing and Hollywood productions. Some of the best work on it is the work from, I learned from Hitchcock and his storyboarding techniques. I'm not sure the bibliographical reference. If you let me go offline, I'll find you some reference material. But there's actually I've studied some of his storyboards, and it's remarkably similar to what we do in task analysis. So it's the motion picture industry uses storyboards a lot to to sort of especially with multiple camera shots and
Hmm.
you have something going on and you want it step one, step two, step three, and you sort of look at it exactly like an American comic book, right? All the frames in there. So I do see it in software engineering, in task analysis, user scenario design, and user experience testing. I think it could be used a lot more, but I don't think it's popularized anywhere. User stories in agile teams don't even really emphasize storyboarding. They emphasize stories,
Hmm.
but not the correctness or the completeness of the process steps. In fact, it's quite the opposite. They want a story that doesn't have all those detailed steps so that the team can figure out the detail later. So an agile person might argue I have too much detail.
Interesting.
I don't necessarily agree with that, but I can see where the argument would come in.
Right. Well, that's a great technique. I appreciate the story. That was fun talking to you today.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And I will, if I can figure out how to turn off the various recording devices. Okay, so that was 42 minutes and 40 seconds according to my recording device here.
Okay.
Let's turn that one off. And let me just get to my other recording device.